moments in time when heaven and earth seem to collide, when the words spoken by men carry the weight of destinies, nations, and the cries of generations. We have just witnessed one of those moments, a moment when the voice of the world's stage collided with the soul of a rising warrior. Barack Obama spoke, but it was not just politics. It was power, prophecy, and provocation. And in that moment, Ibrahim Traoré, a man molded in the fire of Burkina Faso's battle, was brought to tears. But the tears were not of weakness. No, these were the tears of a man standing on sacred ground, tears of a soldier realizing the cost of truth, the price of destiny, and the awakening of a generation long silenced. This is not about politics. This is not about leaders alone. This is about a shaking, a calling, a collision between kingdoms, between the kingdoms of this world and the kingdom that cannot be shaken. Why did Ibrahim Traoré weep? Because the words that were spoken carried the echo of a system long used to manipulate, control, and dominate. When Barack Obama spoke, it wasn't just one man to another. It was the voice of the old world speaking to the rise of the new. A voice from the towers of empire speaking to the child of Africa, now turned into a lion. A voice polished with diplomacy, but behind it, centuries of strategy, wealth, and influence. And yet, Ibrahim stood, he listened, and he wept. Because there comes a moment when the soul recognizes the weight of the battle it is truly in. This is not merely about Burkina Faso. It is not merely about one man's leadership. This is the continent's cry. The cry of a people saying, we will no longer be slaves in our own land. And when Obama spoke, it was as if the veils were pulled back. The old guard questioned the young lion. The empire called the rebel a threat. The polished voice cloaked the ancient control. But Traoré, he did not answer with words. He answered with tears. Tears that cried, I know what I carry is greater than me. I feel the pressure of leading a nation out of bondage. I hear the voice of my ancestors crying out for justice. I see the manipulation, but I will not bow. Maybe young, but I am not blind. His tears were not surrender. They were intercession. They were awakening. They were prophecy. Because sometimes the greatest revolutions begin not with swords, not with speeches, but with tears. And those tears speak louder than words. The systems of this world are shaking. What once seemed unshakable is trembling. And the rise of voices like Traoré's is not by chance. It is divine timing. The world watched one man cry, but heaven saw a mantle fall. The mantle of deliverance, the mantle of resistance, the mantle of purpose. When Barack Obama spoke, the world listened. But in that moment, something deeper happened. A rupture in the spiritual realm, a confrontation that pierced beyond the surface of political decorum. It was the sound of the empire speaking, not one man, but a machine, a global system. The polished, articulate voice represented centuries of crafted power, wrapped in diplomacy, delivered with charisma, but charged with control. And what was being challenged was not just one leader's policy, but a worldview that has reigned for generations. Understand this: when empire speaks, it speaks with authority. It speaks from high towers, marble halls, and secure walls. It speaks as if it has the right to define truth. It does not speak as a guest. It speaks as a master. It is used to being obeyed, to being unchallenged, to having its words echoed by those who fear its disapproval or crave its affirmation. But for the first time, the voice of the empire was not met with applause or accommodation. It was met with stillness, with a silence so deep that it pierced the airwaves. And from that silence came not words, but tears. Tears from Ibrahim Traoré. But those tears were more than emotion. They were resistance. They were revelation. They were the breaking of an illusion that had held sway over nations for far too long. You see, the empire does not like to be challenged. It prefers a world that bows, that nods, that smiles while being subdued. It rewards loyalty, not truth. And when it speaks, it expects alignment. But Traoré did not align. He did not return the favor. He did not echo the applause. Instead, he broke, not in weakness, but in awakening. He saw through the words, through the image, through the carefully calculated performance. And he realized what was being said was not just a message. It was a mantle of power being reasserted. The empire was saying, we still rule. We still define what is right. We still hold the scepter. But in that moment, something ancient rose up inside him. Something from the soil of Africa, from the blood of his forefathers, from the cries of the colonized, from the prayers of the oppressed, from the fire of every martyr who dared to speak truth to power. He wept because he understood that this moment was not simply political. It was prophetic. The empire was being challenged not by military force, but by the sheer weight of unshakable conviction, by the audacity of a young man refusing to bend his knee to a throne built on centuries of exploitation and illusion. And the empire felt it. That is why it responded. That is why it spoke with subtle warnings, clever deflections, smooth manipulation. Because the moment someone refuses to be controlled by its narrative, it reacts. Not with open hostility, but with veiled concern, with carefully veiled condemnation wrapped in phrases like progress, stability, democracy. But those who see in the Spirit understand. These are not words of concern. They are tools of control. And that control was challenged on live television, not with weapons, not with shouting, but with tears. Tears that said, I see you. I see what this is. I see what you're doing, but I will not bow. But the power of this moment is that for the first time, the empire's voice is losing its authority. It still speaks, but its words no longer hold the same weight. Because there are those who have been awakened, who know that peace without justice is slavery, that unity without truth is tyranny, and they are rising. Ibrahim Traoré's tears spoke for every young African who has watched their leaders sell their nations for applause in global forums. They spoke for every mother who lost her son to a war funded by outside interests. They spoke for every child taught to despise their own skin, their own tongue, their own land. They were not just personal tears, they were generational. And now the empire trembles because the shaking has begun. Its voice has been challenged, not with rebellion, but with revelation, not with fury, but with clarity, not with hate, but with holy defiance. The world may not understand what happened in that moment, but the heavens do, and the earth does, and the nations will. Because once the voice of the empire is challenged, it cannot remain unshaken. It begins to crack, and from the cracks, the light of truth begins to shine. And truth, once released, cannot be silenced. The lion has roared. The veil has been torn. The voice of the empire has been confronted, and nothing will ever be the same again. The world saw tears streaming down the face of Ibrahim Traoré, and many wondered what they meant. But those who walk in the Spirit understand. Tears are never just water from the eyes. They are the language of the soul, the overflow of a heart that is too full to speak. too burdened to remain silent, too moved to remain still. In that moment, when Barack Obama's words echoed across the screen, the tears that fell were not weakness. They were a sign of something ancient and burning, a deeper fire that had been ignited within him. This is the mystery of divine breaking. For there are times when a man is not broken by defeat, but by the weight of purpose. Times when the fire within burns so hot that it reaches the eyes and breaks through in the form of weeping. Not because he has lost, but because he has seen, because he has understood, because he has felt, not just for himself, but for an entire nation, an entire generation. The fire is not for show. The fire is not to be broadcast. The fire is personal, private, prophetic. And when that fire burns, it purifies, it presses, it breaks the man to remake him. Traoré's tears were not a sign that he was overwhelmed by Obama's presence. No. They were the sign that he had stepped into a moment greater than politics. He had stepped into destiny. The words spoken were not just opinions. They were judgments, crafted narratives, echoes of a system that has long tried to silence the voice of rising nations. But the fire within him rose up, and the tears came, not from fear, but from the collision of truth and oppression, of light and shadow, of calling and consequence. For this is how fire moves in a leader. It begins with burden. It begins with the weight of people crying for freedom, for justice, for restoration. It begins with the groan of the land, the sound of blood crying from the soil, the sound of generations waiting for someone to stand. That fire does not come from speeches or strategies. It comes from sacrifice. It comes from suffering. It comes from surrender. And when that fire reaches its fullness, it overflows. And often it overflows through tears. The world is trained to despise the weeping of men. It sees tears as weakness, emotion, vulnerability. But the scriptures and the Spirit declare something different. The greatest deliverers were men who wept. Prophets wept over nations. Kings wept before battles. Even the Son of God wept before the raising of the dead. Because tears are not the sign of collapse. They are the sign of compassion, of warfare, of intercession. They are the groanings too deep for words, the outward cry of an inward fire. What was burning inside Traoré was more than national pride. It was the ache of a people finally refusing to live in chains. It was the revelation that standing against empire comes at a cost. It was the realization that to carry the fire of deliverance is to also carry the pain of rejection, of resistance, of relentless pressure. And in that moment, the tears said it all. I know what this means. I know what this will take. And I'm still standing. There is a fire rising in the earth, and it does not roar like thunder. It weeps like rivers. It does not march in parades. It kneels in silence. It does not announce itself. It burns quietly until the day it cannot be ignored. That fire was kindled in Traoré's heart long before the cameras rolled. But when Obama's words came like wind to provoke, the fire responded not with flames, but with tears. And those tears were holy, because they were born from the furnace of a soul that has counted the cost and still chosen the call. Many can speak boldly. Few can weep honestly. Many can wear crowns. Few can bear crosses. But when you see a man weep under the weight of purpose, do not mistake it for fragility. It is the preparation of a vessel chosen by heaven. Because before a man is sent to war, he must pass through the fire. And before he carries the sword, he must carry the tears. Ibrahim Traoré's tears were not the end of a moment. They were the beginning of a movement. The kind of movement that will not be led by loud voices, but by burning hearts. Hearts that carry nations. Hearts that grieve for injustice. Hearts that burn for freedom. And when those hearts are pierced, they weep. Not to give up, but to go deeper. To burn hotter. To rise higher. For the fire is real, the burden is heavy, and the tears are holy. There was a time when the narrative of a continent was written without its voice, when the destiny of nations was dictated by strangers sitting behind polished desks in faraway lands, when the soil of Africa was rich with diamonds, oil, and gold, but her voice was chained, her hands tied, and her truth rewritten. Her leaders were chosen not by the people, but by powers behind curtains. Her history was distorted, her language diluted, her soul suffocated. But that time is ending, and the world is witnessing the beginning of the reversal. When Ibrahim Traoré stood and wept, it was more than a personal moment. It was a prophetic declaration. A young man standing in defiance, not just of one statement, not just of one leader, but of the centuries-old script written by the empires of the world. A script where Africa was always portrayed as the dependent, the broken, the helpless. A script where she could only rise with foreign aid, only survive under foreign approval, only speak if her words matched the tone of the West. But now that script is being torn. Because Africa is no longer bowing, no longer silent, no longer content with waiting for permission to speak, act, or lead. What the world witnessed was not just the tears of a leader. It was the groaning of a continent breaking out of the mold it was forced into. It was the sound of generations crying out, "We are not your project. We are not your charity. We are not your pawn. We are a people, a culture, a calling, and we will rise." The systems that once controlled Africa used chains made not only of iron, but of language, of diplomacy, of education. Africa's elite were trained to speak with borrowed tongues, to think with foreign frameworks, to echo the values of their colonizers rather than the cries of their people. They were molded to fit into conferences and summits, but not into their own soil. And in exchange for applause from the world, they traded the sovereignty of their people. But a new generation is awakening, and they are no longer asking what the world thinks. Ibrahim Traoré is not alone. He is part of something larger, something holy, something ancient being revived. The rise of leaders who speak in their own voice, who carry their own fire, who refuse to bend to the scripts handed down by institutions that profited from Africa's silence. Leaders who no longer seek to impress, but to liberate, who care more about the soul of their people than the praise of international media. And that is what terrifies the old systems, because they can no longer predict, control, or manipulate those who no longer need them. The scripts written in foreign tongues always come with a cost. The cost of identity, the cost of dignity, the cost of truth. But now, Africa is reclaiming all three. She is beginning to write again with the ink of struggle, the pen of memory, and the fire of vision. And the world must adjust to a new reality. Africa will speak, and she will not speak softly. She will lead, and she will not ask for permission. She will decide, and she will do so with full authority. That is why Traoré's tears mattered, because they were not tears of weakness. They were the pain of a generation breaking out of captivity. They were the labor pains of a nation birthing its own narrative. They were the sound of a man who has seen the script, rejected it, and chosen to write a new one on behalf of the forgotten, the exploited, the silenced. It is the moment when borrowed voices fall silent and the true voice of the land begins to roar. This is not arrogance. It is restoration. Africa was not meant to be silent. She was not created to be dependent. She carries wisdom, beauty, power, and purpose. But until now, those gifts were buried under layers of propaganda, treaties, and economic chains. Now they are rising to the surface. And every tear shed by a leader like Traoré is watering that soil, preparing the ground for a harvest of truth, of strength, of sovereignty. Africa is not waiting for her turn at the table. She is building her own table. She is not learning to copy speeches. She is giving her own. And when she speaks, the world will have to listen, not because of pity, not because of protocol, but because her voice carries the thunder of history and the weight of destiny. The old scripts are burning. The new voices are rising. And Africa will no longer be edited, controlled, or cast aside. Her time is now. Her voice is her own. And she will never bow again. There is a stirring across the earth, a sound not born in the halls of government or in the corridors of power, but in the secret place, in the wilderness, in the depths where only truth survives. It is the sound of something ancient awakening. A mantle long forgotten, a voice long silenced. It is the return of the prophetic fire, the return of men and women who do not govern for popularity, but for purpose, who do not seek the favor of kings, but carry the word of the King of Kings. And this fire, this spirit, is returning to the thrones of the earth. For too long, the thrones have been filled with officials who speak, but do not see, who decide, but do not discern, who lead, but without revelation. The age of political puppets and polished actors is being exposed. They speak in circles, they bow to donors, they sell truth for comfort. They have the throne but lack the oil. They have the crown but not the calling. But now the wind is shifting and heaven is doing what only heaven can do. It is raising up voices that carry more than authority. They carry burden. They carry the word. They carry the fire. When Ibrahim Traoré stood in silence with tears in his eyes, what the world saw was a moment of vulnerability. But in the spirit, it was a moment of mantling. A moment where God reached into the confusion of world affairs and placed his hand on a man, not because he was perfect, but because he was willing, because he had not been bought, not been silenced, not been seduced. And in that moment, something was restored, not just to Traoré, but to the throne itself, a prophetic presence, a spirit that had long been banished by bureaucracy, a voice that does not echo what others say, but declares what must be said, regardless of consequence. Understand this, the prophet does not care for applause. He is not impressed by titles. He does not negotiate with darkness. He sees what others cannot see and speaks what others fear to speak. And when the spirit of the prophet returns to the throne, the land begins to shift. Justice awakens. Corruption trembles. The people begin to breathe again because the prophetic voice does not serve man. It serves truth. It serves God. It is answerable to a higher authority, one that no ballot box or boardroom can control. The return of this spirit is not just about one man or one nation. It is a sign of the times. It is happening across the world. Young leaders rising who are not interested in building their brand, but in breaking chains. Men and women stepping into positions of power who carry the whisper of the wilderness, the thunder of Sinai, the vision of the watchman. They are not trained by institutions. They are forged by fire. They do not quote trends. They declare the ancient word. And they are dangerous, not because they seek to destroy, but because they cannot be manipulated. This is why systems built on deception fear them. This is why global powers tremble when they speak, because they cannot be bribed, silenced, or controlled. They answer to something beyond politics. They dream dreams that were never handed down by governments. They see visions that do not align with the blueprints of empire. They carry the urgency of heaven, and heaven is not passive. Heaven does not wait for permission. When God places a prophet on a throne, it is because the time of judgment and restoration has come. Ibrahim Traoré is not just a leader, he is a sign that the season has changed, that the age of empty speeches is over. That God is looking for thrones he can fill with fire, thrones that no longer echo Babylon, but carry the sound of Zion. Thrones that no longer suppress the people, but lift them. Thrones that are not afraid to say, I have seen the Lord, and I will not serve Pharaoh. This is the pattern of Scripture. Joseph stood in Egypt not to serve Egypt, but to save the covenant people. Daniel sat among Babylon's rulers not to join them, but to confront them. Esther was brought into the palace not to enjoy the throne, but to risk everything for her people. And now, in this generation, the same pattern is returning. The prophetic is finding its place again, not just in the pulpits, but in parliaments. Not just in churches, but in chambers of law. Not just in intercession, but in influence. And it is terrifying the darkness. Because when the spirit of the prophet returns to the throne, the nations awaken. The captives begin to hope. The oppressed begin to dream. And the empire begins to shake. Not from revolution, not from rebellion, but from revelation. A revelation that no throne is higher than God's, and no system can silence a man who has been set on fire by heaven. The prophets are returning. And this time, they will not just speak to kings. They will be kings with tears in their eyes, with fire in their bones, and with the voice of heaven in their mouth. Destiny is not born in safety. It is not awakened in comfort. It does not rise from polished stages or padded chairs. Destiny is forged in the fire. It is activated in the storm. It is triggered by collision, by the crashing of what is and what must be. And in that collision, something eternal is shaken loose. When Ibrahim Traoré stood in the tension of opposing voices, when the words of Barack Obama, a symbol of the world's established order, were released into the air, something deeper collided in the spirit. It wasn't politics meeting politics. It was purpose meeting resistance. It was calling clashing with control. And in that moment, destiny was triggered. We are deceived if we think that greatness emerges in ease. The scriptures and the chronicles of history declare the opposite. Abraham's destiny was awakened not in a land of rest, but in the call to leave everything behind. Moses did not encounter his purpose in Pharaoh's palace, but in the wilderness where the bush burned and the voice called. David was not made king in the comfort of Saul's court, but in the caves of resistance and the fields of rejection. Even Christ did not emerge from the synagogue, but from the desert, with a voice crying out and a confrontation looming. So it is now. When the established order speaks with power, it assumes the right to shape the world. But when a prophetic leader listens and does not submit, when he weeps, not in surrender, but in sorrowful resolve, he is not breaking. He is becoming. Becoming what the moment demands. Becoming what history has long waited for. Becoming what God whispered in the silence before the foundations of the world. But that becoming does not happen in comfort. It is born of conflict, born of fire, born of collision. Traoré's tears marked the moment when the mask of global diplomacy fell, when the polite fiction that all nations are equal was exposed, when the clash between freedom and control, between sovereignty and subjugation was made visible. And in that clash, destiny was awakened, not just for a man, but for a nation, perhaps even for a continent. For when a man stands in the face of the empire and weeps, not out of fear, but out of fire, you are watching prophecy in motion. Collision is necessary. Without resistance, the seed never breaks open. Without pressure, the oil never flows. Without shaking, the chains never fall. And it is in the moment of impact, when the weight of purpose crashes against the systems of delay, that destiny erupts. You cannot plan it. You cannot schedule it. It comes suddenly, violently, like the upper room wind, like the voice crying in the wilderness. It comes when two worlds collide. What is and what must be. This is the season we have entered. A season where comfort will not lead us, where convenience will not carry us, where destiny demands confrontation. And those unwilling to collide with the structures of false peace will never walk in the fullness of their calling. God is looking for those who will not avoid the fire, but will walk into it, knowing that the fire reveals who you truly are. Traoré stood, surrounded by forces greater than him in the natural. Wealth, influence, legacy, and the invisible machinery of global power. But something in him would not bend. Something burned. Something ancient. And though the words of power were spoken at him, they did not move him. They awakened him. For destiny often lies dormant until pressure comes. And when it comes, the choice is made: collapse or rise, run or stand, fade or burn. It is not the smooth moments that define a generation. It is the collisions. The moments when voices challenge each other and history watches. The moments when courage is not loud but steady. When fire meets steel. When tears flow not from fear, but from the recognition that something eternal is being birthed in pain. These are the moments that shape nations, that awaken sleeping giants, that shift the course of empires. You were not born for comfort. You were born for impact, and impact comes at a cost. It will bruise your pride. It will wound your flesh. It will isolate your soul, but it will also ignite your spirit. And in that ignition, you will find what you were created for. Traoré did not break under the pressure. He was built by it. And in that moment of collision, his destiny moved from possibility to manifestation. The words against him were meant to shame him, but instead they shaped him. The tears that fell were not surrender. They were activation. They were the visible sign that the collision had happened and something eternal had been triggered. So too, for every soul born with purpose, know this: destiny will not come to you in still waters. It will come in the storm. It will come when your calling crashes into resistance. And when it does, don't run. Stand, weep if you must, but stand. For what breaks others bursts the called. What crushes the weak crowns the chosen. And in the heat of the collision, you will see it, the face of purpose, the fire of God, the birth of destiny. And so we arrive at the edge of the moment, a moment not just political, not merely historical, but prophetic. A moment when the cries of one man expose the fault lines beneath the entire system of power. A moment when a single tear speaks louder than treaties, louder than speeches, louder than armies. What the world witnessed when Ibrahim Traoré cried was not weakness, but a sign that the old wine is bursting the wineskin, a sign that the ground beneath the feet of the powerful is beginning to shake, a sign that something divine is in motion. Because when the cry of a righteous man pierces the air, heaven responds. The blood of the martyrs speaks, but so do the tears of the burdened. Traoré's tears were not from brokenness, but from the weight of calling, from the friction of truth rubbing against the lies of empire, from the pressure of destiny pushing against the walls of a corrupt order. And in that collision, something shifted. It was not about Barack Obama. It was not about one statement. It was not about diplomacy or disagreement. It was about the veil being lifted. It was about a stage prepared by man being interrupted by the hand of God. It was about the moment when a servant of destiny feels the trembling of a mantle fall on his shoulders, not by vote, not by title, but by divine fire. A shift not just for Burkina Faso, not just for Africa, but for every person who has ever felt the fire of calling and the cold hand of opposition. We are watching the end of one age and the rise of another. The age of quiet submission, of polite oppression, of whispered truths hidden in back rooms. It is over. The age when Africa had to wait her turn, speak when spoken to, and govern under the shadow of foreign tongues. It is crumbling. The thrones of deception are trembling because they were never built to last. They were built on exploitation, on control, on silence. But when the prophets rise, the silence breaks. And now the nations must reckon with something they cannot measure: the fire of purpose. What has been awakened will not return to sleep. What has been seen cannot be unseen. A generation has heard the cry, and they know it's time not to imitate, not to impress, but to ignite, to rise as their true selves, to lead with courage, to speak with thunder, to carry the ancestral roar of a people who have been held back not because they were weak, but because they were powerful. Traoré's tears are now etched into the soul of this moment, not because they made him small, but because they revealed the enormity of the struggle and the depth of the calling. Those tears were prophetic. They baptized the battlefield. They were not the end. They were the beginning of a new kind of leader, a leader who carries both sword and psalm, a leader who can weep and still war, a leader who fears nothing but failing heaven's mandate. And the world, oh, the world is not ready, because these kinds of leaders do not ask for permission. They do not bow to the protocols of empire. They carry a sound that disrupts the comfortable, that shatters the illusion of neutrality. They rise with the urgency of eternity. And once they rise, nothing stays the same. Not the courts, not the currencies, not the colonies in disguise. Because once a man touches destiny, he becomes unshakable. Once a continent finds her voice, she becomes unstoppable. You see, every empire fears one thing: not weapons, not protests, but awakening. Empires thrive in the dark. They succeed when the masses sleep. But when the people wake up, when they remember who they are, when they see through the veil, empires fall. And this is what has begun. You were never meant to live in chains, even golden ones. You were not made to repeat the lines of others. You were born to be a voice, a fire, a shaking. The world does not need more noise. It needs witnesses. People who have collided with calling, who have stared into the fire and did not run. People who have heard the cry of nations, the groaning of creation, and said, "Here I am. Send me. So let Traoré's tears speak. Let them echo across the land. Let them stir the buried bones of identity. Let them water the seed of awakening. Because this is not about one man's emotion. It is about a generation's eruption. It is about the voice of the silenced finally breaking the surface. It is about the moment when heaven's timeline interrupts history's script. And now the choice is before us all. Will we return to sleep, or will we rise and burn? Because the tears have fallen. The mantle has descended. The trumpet has sounded. And now destiny calls.